Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
You'd think that after nearly 4 decades of living on this earth, I'd know how to handle a holiday dinner without it turning into a full-blown psychological ambush. But that's the thing about family, especially the kind that looks perfect from the outside but rots quietly from the inside. They know exactly where to poke, exactly when to press, and they do it with a smile so sweet it makes your teeth ache. That Thanksgiving was supposed to be a peaceful one. I had taken time off work, cooked 2 pies from scratch like some 1950s homemaker, and even wore a dress my father once said made me look respectable. I'd convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But of course, it wasn't. Dinner started as it always did. My father, Roy, sat at the head of the table like he was a damn king. He carved the turkey like it was a ritual, talking about how he used to hunt birds, back when men still did real things. My brother Jake nodded like he was hearing the story for the first time, though we'd all heard it every Thanksgiving since Mom passed. Everyone smiled politely, passed the cranberry sauce, and ignored the growing storm in Roy's eyes. Something about the way he stared at me, like he was just waiting for me to misstep. It came after the second glass of wine. I made a comment, something small and innocent, about how I'd been thinking of moving to a different city, maybe starting fresh. I didn't even finish the sentence before his fork hit the plate with a clang. The room went silent, the kind of silence you only hear in houses where people are used to holding their breath. Roy leaned back in his chair, napkin still tucked into his collar like a bib, and said loud enough for even the kids at the other table to hear, "You're gonna move? With what, the money you don't have or the spine you never grew?" There it was, the whole room froze. Not because they were shocked, but because they knew better than to react. That's the thing about long-term emotional abuse. It teaches everyone in the family how to pretend. Jake looked down. My aunt cleared her throat. Even my cousin, who once told me he admired how strong I was, stayed quiet and took another bite of stuffing. Roy didn't stop there. He waved his hand at me like I was some disappointment he'd ordered off a menu by mistake. "You're almost 40, Aaron. You're still living in the condo I gave you after your mother died, still driving the car I let you have, still clinging to that part-time job like it's a real career. When are you going to grow up and stop leeching off everyone else's hard work?" That was the moment something in me cracked. I'd taken it for years. The passive-aggressive remarks, the unsolicited advice disguised as judgment, the way he used money like a leash and called it love. I'd told myself that I needed to keep the peace, that confronting him wouldn't solve anything, that I'd wait until I was truly independent before standing up for myself. But something about him saying, "You're not welcome here anymore," in front of everyone, like I was some bum off the street crashing his party, flipped a switch. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't even respond. I just stood up slowly, pushed my chair in like a goddamn adult, picked up my purse, and walked out. No drama, no door slam, just silence. The kind of silence that, I hoped, would haunt him more than any words I could ever say. The car ride home was quiet, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I had too much. My fingers were trembling on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from something else, rage maybe, or maybe just the sudden realization that the man who helped raise me never actually saw me as a person. Just a liability, a debt. When I got back to the condo, his gift that he reminded me about every damn birthday and Christmas, I poured a drink and sat on the couch. I stared at the blank TV screen for what felt like hours. My phone buzzed with messages from family members. "He didn't mean it like that. He's just old-fashioned. Don't take it personally." But I wasn't angry at them. I was angry at myself for staying silent for so long, for playing along, for thinking I could ever change the dynamic if I just behaved better. And that's when it hit me. He kept saying I needed to act like an adult, that I was dependent, that I didn't know how the world worked without him pulling the strings. Maybe he was right. Maybe I hadn't been acting like an adult, but not for the reasons he thought. Being an adult isn't about sucking it up and taking abuse just because the person dishing it out shares your blood. Being an adult is about drawing a line in the sand and saying, no more. So I decided to give him what he wanted. I'd act like an adult. I'd stop taking his help. I'd cut him out. But not in the quiet, passive way he expected. I wasn't going to disappear and cry in the dark while hoping he'd come around. I was going to burn the whole damn bridge down, and I was going to make sure he felt it. Because if there's one thing Roy always underestimated about me, it's that I remember everything. Every insult, every manipulation, every moment he made me feel small just to make himself feel big. He called me ungrateful, said I bit the hand that fed me. Well, guess what? I've got teeth, and it's about damn time I use them. I woke up the next morning with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The kind that wraps around your spine and straightens it, makes your feet heavier on the floor when you stand up. Like you finally stopped floating in someone else's orbit and started walking in your own direction. The air in the condo was cold, not because the heater was broken, but because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't pretending I owed someone my warmth. I made coffee slowly, without rushing, and sat in the silence of my own decision, which felt heavier than any conversation I could have had with Roy or anyone else from that godforsaken dinner table. It wasn't about the turkey or the wine or the goddamn cranberry sauce. It was about control, and I finally realized I'd been part of a game I never signed up to play. The condo I lived in, he called it a gift after Mom died, but let's be honest, gifts don't come with strings that choke you. And the car I drove, the one he claimed was his, it had been my mother's. He never got it transferred into his name after the funeral. I remembered that detail because I was the one who found the title papers when I was packing her things, tucked away in an envelope labeled, "In case I forget who I am." She had scribbled that phrase on more than one folder, as if even she needed reminders that she was more than Roy's wife, more than a woman trapped inside a narrative she didn't write. So that morning, after finishing my coffee, I grabbed my laptop and logged into the DMV portal. My fingers were steady. I searched for the car's VIN number, typed in my name, and stared at the screen as it confirmed what I already knew but needed to see in black and white. The car was registered to my mother, and in the absence of a legal transfer or sale, it belonged to her next of kin, me, not Roy, not the man who made me feel like I had to ask for permission just to use a vehicle my mother once drove to buy groceries for the family he was so proud to dominate. It was mine. Legally, officially, and as of that moment, spiritually too, but I wasn't done. Revenge, if it's going to mean anything, has to come in layers, not just with a slap to the face, but with a slow unraveling of everything someone thought they controlled. I called my friend Jenna, who's been a family attorney for over a decade and knows the system better than most. I told her what happened, what Roy said, how he used the shared credit card in both our names for his emergencies, which always seemed to include cigars, overpriced bourbon, and some suspicious charges at an outdoor outfitter, despite the man barely walking farther than his mailbox. She laughed bitterly and said, "It's time you take your name back." And that's exactly what I did. Jenna helped me draft a termination of authorization for the card, then walked me through filing a fraud alert just in case he tried to open anything else in my name. It wasn't a war, it was a liberation. One careful step at a time, I was pulling myself out of the mud he threw me in years ago, long before that Thanksgiving, back when I was too young to know that being taken care of sometimes meant being smothered. Blocking his number felt like brushing off the final bit of dust. I stared at his name on the screen, just Dad in my contact list. And it looked ridiculous. Pathetic even, like something a child would type in before realizing that titles don't mean respect is automatic. I hit block and tossed the phone on the couch like it was buzzing with static from another lifetime. And just like that, I was unreachable. Not because I was running, but because I was done being found in places I didn't belong. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, though. It was loud, a different kind of loud. The kind that creeps in when your brain starts asking the questions it should have asked years ago. What happens now? What will he do? Am I really free, or is this just the eye of the storm? That's the trick with people like Roy. They make you think they're gone, make you believe that you finally escaped, and then they twist the knife when you least expect it, just to prove you were never the one holding it in the first place. I didn't have to wait long to find out what his next move was. Exactly 48 hours after I blocked his number, I was halfway through a Monday shift at the medical supply warehouse I managed. Bless the heartless predictability of corporate life, when one of the younger guys from shipping burst into my office with this look on his face, like he'd just seen a car crash in the parking lot. "There's a man here asking for you," he said, already whispering, like he knew this wasn't going to be good. I stepped out into the warehouse's loading bay, heart pounding, trying to brace myself. And there he was, Roy, standing there like he belonged, in his cheap leather jacket and pressed slacks that screamed midlife crisis, holding a folder like he thought waving some papers in the air was going to undo what I'd done. His face was flushed, either from the cold or from the humiliation of showing up to his daughter's workplace like some broken-down debtor who finally realized the bank was closed. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, he just looked at me with a kind of desperation I'd never seen before. And I mean never, not even when Mom died and he had to pretend to cry for the neighbors. This wasn't performative grief or righteous anger. It was panic. He stepped forward, and I didn't move. I stood like a statue carved out of every insult he'd ever thrown at me, every passive-aggressive comment, every time he'd used silence as a weapon. "Aaron, please," he said, voice cracking like a radio with bad reception. "We need to talk." And all I could think, as my coworkers watched from behind forklift shelves and boxes of sterile gauze, was how poetic it was, how right it felt, that the man who told me I wasn't welcome at his table anymore was now showing up to mine, empty-handed and begging. The image of him standing there, shoulders hunched just enough to suggest vulnerability, but not so much as to actually surrender his pride, stayed with me long after I closed the warehouse door behind me, even as I sat back at my desk, pretending to type something meaningful into an empty spreadsheet while the fluorescent lights buzzed above me like they knew a secret I didn't. I could still feel his presence clinging to the air, like cigarette smoke or bad perfume. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing him that way, stripped of the superiority he wore like cologne, reduced to an aging man who no longer knew how to function without the control he once held so tightly. But that satisfaction didn't last long because the truth is, I wasn't as numb to it as I wanted to be. It still rattled me, seeing him show up like that. No warning, no apology, just a pathetic plea for a conversation. As if he hadn't spent decades turning every one of our interactions into a power struggle disguised as parental concern. I didn't respond. I didn't return his gaze or follow him outside when he loitered near the loading dock for nearly 15 minutes, like some lost dog, hoping someone might toss him a bone of forgiveness. Eventually, the warehouse manager asked him to leave, citing company policy, though I suspect the look on my face was enough to make it clear that this wasn't some sweet family reunion. After he was gone, I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone, half expecting another text or voicemail or some desperate attempt to claw back into the space I'd finally closed off to him. But there was nothing, just silence again. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was worried about what he'd do next, but because I was starting to question how much of myself I'd lost to this quiet war we'd been waging for years. I thought about all the times I'd let him twist my words into accusations, about every moment I bit my tongue at family gatherings to avoid making a scene, about the nights I cried in my car outside the condo because going inside meant confronting the reality that the place didn't feel like home. It felt like a cage with crown molding. It wasn't until 3 a.m, curled up on the floor with a blanket I hadn't used since college, that I admitted to myself that the pain wasn't just from him. It was from me too, from the way I let him convince me I was small, incapable, dependent. And it was in that cold silence that I realized I needed more than revenge. I needed the truth. The next day, I drove across town to my Aunt Carol's house. She was my mother's sister, the kind of woman who always had an opinion, but rarely offered it unless asked, which made her one of the few people in the family I actually trusted. She opened the door with a weary smile, the kind that said she'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time. We sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee as she fidgeted with the corner of a faded placemat. And I asked the question that had been eating at me since Roy showed up at my job. "What do you know about the trust?" At first she looked confused, or maybe just surprised that I knew to ask. Then she sighed, a long, heavy thing that seemed to carry the weight of years she'd tried to ignore. "Your mother set it up when you were 16, she said slowly. She didn't tell Roy about it at first. She was scared he'd use it for himself. That hit me harder than I expected. My mother, my quiet, obedient mother, had tried to protect me in a way I never knew, hiding money in legal loopholes and documents I never saw. Carol explained that after Mom passed, Roy petitioned to gain control of the trust, claiming he needed it to pay for my living expenses. She didn't know the exact details, only that he never gave a full accounting and the money, intended for my future, somehow vanished over the years into God knows what. I sat there stunned, the room spinning around me in a haze of betrayal that felt sharper than anything Roy had ever said to my face. It wasn't just that he'd insulted me or humiliated me, or tried to control my life. He'd stolen from me, from my mother's memory, from the future she'd tried to give me in secret. The betrayal ran deeper than I ever imagined, threading through every dollar he spent on golf memberships and luxury liquor bottles, every smug smile he wore when he reminded me I couldn't afford to live without him. Carol handed me a manila envelope, something she'd kept just in case I ever asked. Inside were copies of the original trust documents and a letter from my mother, dated 2 months before her death. In it, she wrote about her fears, about how she hoped I would find strength, even if she couldn't give it to me in person. "You are more than what he says you are," she wrote in loopy cursive. "And one day, I hope you stop believing his version of you." I drove home in a fog, the envelope like a lead weight in the passenger seat. Every red light felt like a moment to scream, every green light like a dare to keep going. I was angry, no, furious. But beneath that was a sadness so raw, I couldn't even cry. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what that money represented. Freedom, trust, protection, a legacy my mother tried to preserve and he so casually consumed. Back at the condo, I sat down at the kitchen table and started making a list. Not of things to do, but of things to reclaim. My voice, my choices, my mother's legacy. The money, yes, but also the truth. Because if Roy thought he could show up, weep a little, and wipe the slate clean, he was even more deluded than I thought. He may have started this fire years ago, but I was the one holding the matches now, and I wasn't going to stop until every lie he ever told me went up in smoke. There's a particular kind of rage that doesn't look like fire or sound like screaming. It doesn't throw things or slam doors, but instead creeps in slow and cold, tightening itself around your ribs until even breathing feels like an act of war. And that's the rage I felt the morning I walked into the courthouse to start the paperwork required to audit the trust fund that was meant to secure my future, but had instead become the quiet source of my father's luxuries and his smug sense of superiority. It wasn't just that he stole money, people do that every day in ways big and small. It was that he stole it from my mother's ghost, from the only person in that entire family who ever looked at me with love that didn't come stapled to conditions or folded into manipulation. The legal clerk at the probate office didn't flinch when I laid the documents down on her desk, though I half expected her to question whether I even had the right to open the case again. But no, she just nodded, handed me a series of forms that smelled like old paper and fluorescent lights, and told me in that dry, procedural tone that it could take weeks to get access to the full financial records. I thanked her, folded the documents neatly into a binder I brought from home, and walked back to my car with a kind of satisfaction that wasn't joy and wasn't relief, but something else, something bitter and righteous, like chewing on steel. The thing is, once you start pulling on the loose threads of a life built on secrets, you start to see how many corners were bent, how many stories were rehearsed, and how many people around you were either complicit or too cowardly to ask questions. My Aunt Carol, bless her heart, had clearly known more than she ever let on, and though I didn't blame her, Because who wants to ignite a family war when they're just trying to survive the holidays? I couldn't stop thinking about all the birthday cards from Roy that included $50 checks and a note that said, "Don't spend it on anything stupid," as if that was the full measure of a father's affection. I started digging, not just through bank statements and property records, but through my memories, retracing every financial decision he made after my mother died, every upgrade in his life that coincided with a downgrade in mine. There was the year he bought that shiny black SUV claiming it was a retirement investment, even though he never retired and spent more time at the golf club than any job I ever heard about. There was the time he loaned money to Jake to cover a failed business venture, money that, it turns out, was drawn from the very account meant to cover my education, my housing, my damned freedom. Jake claimed he never knew, and maybe he didn't, but ignorance isn't innocence, especially when you're benefiting from the theft of someone else's inheritance. The final confirmation came in the form of a letter from the estate's former financial advisor, a woman named Sandra, who still remembered my mother's voice and said she always felt uncomfortable about the way Roy pushed for control of the trust after the funeral, how he pressured the lawyers with just enough charm to avoid suspicion, but enough aggression to make everyone in the room squirm. She told me in no uncertain terms that my mother's original intention had been to set up the trust in my name directly, but Roy argued I was too young, too emotional, too unstable to handle it, and they gave in, probably because no one wants to argue with a freshly grieving widower who dresses his control and concern. Armed with this information, I did what any woman with a spine made of resentment and long-suppressed intelligence would do. I hired a forensic accountant. It wasn't cheap, but neither was my silence, and I figured if Roy could spend trust money on cigars and scotch, I could spend my own goddamn money on justice. The report took a few days, but when it landed in my inbox, the numbers told a story that words never could. Thousands, tens of thousands, vanished over the years on personal expenses, trips that had nothing to do with me, renovations for a second property I didn't even know he owned, and recurring payments to some shell LLC that, after a few phone calls, turned out to be connected to one of his poker buddies who'd helped him funnel money to avoid taxes. It was bigger than I expected. It always is when you start pulling masks off the people you love. And yet, even with all that evidence stacked like firewood, I didn't go to the police. Not yet. Because the truth is, what I wanted more than justice was something he couldn't give me. I wanted regret. I wanted shame. I wanted him to stand in front of the same mirror I'd looked into for years and see what I saw when I thought I wasn't enough. But that kind of reckoning doesn't come from courtrooms or bank records. It comes from looking someone in the eye and making them understand that you know, and that they'll never be able to lie their way out of it again. So I waited. And then, on a Thursday evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains and the air turned that early autumn sharpness that smells like change, he showed up again, this time not at work, not with papers or anger, but with tears. Real ones, or at least good enough to pass for real. He stood on my porch like a man who'd finally run out of stories to tell and was hoping I had one left to spare. He knocked, quietly, waited. Knocked again. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. I just sat behind the curtain, watched him through the slats, and let him feel what silence really sounds like when it's not a weapon, but a verdict. He stayed for 15 minutes, maybe 20, then left. No note, no voicemail. Just a broken man retreating from the place he once called home, now stripped of the illusion that he still had a daughter who couldn't live without him. There is something disturbingly intimate about watching a man you once called your father unravel in slow, desperate silence. A silence not born from pride or stubbornness, but from the kind of resignation that only appears when someone realizes they no longer hold even the illusion of power over the person they spent decades shaping, breaking, and shaping again. Like some cruel sculptor convinced their chisel was love. In the days after Roy's last appearance on my porch, I expected the silence to bring closure, to wrap itself around my chest like a blanket made from justice, but instead it settled in with the weight of something unresolved, something unfinished, like an itch beneath the skin of my resolve that refused to go away no matter how many times I told myself that I was done, that he no longer mattered, that the war had been won. I kept moving forward because that's what you do when the past starts knocking louder than the future. You build routine like armor and pretend every step you take is away from them, even when some of those steps circle back to memories you can't quite bury. I returned to work, filed the necessary legal documents to freeze what little remained of the trust, and even started browsing listings for a new condo, one that wasn't soaked in the ghosts of old arguments and silent dinners. But even as I made those moves, the echo of his voice, sharpened by years of control and disappointment, still crept in during the quiet moments, and it wasn't until I found the letter in my mailbox that I realized why. The envelope was thick, the kind of thick that says someone finally had more to say than they could say face to face, and it was addressed in his handwriting, unmistakably his, shaky but still arrogant. Each letter etched with that same stubbornness that defined him. I stood on my front steps holding it like a live grenade, not sure if I wanted to read it or light it on fire, but curiosity, maybe the kind born from decades of never getting a real explanation, won out. I sat down in the living room, opened it slowly, and began reading the last confession of a man who never really knew how to speak the language of truth until everything else had already been taken from him. In the letter, he wrote about fear, not in the poetic, self-aware way that movies or books describe it, but in the messy, self-justifying kind of way that only someone who's spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability can express. He said he was scared when my mother died, not just of being alone, but of losing the last person who kept him human, who softened the edges of his temper and made his demands seem like discipline instead of domination. He said he saw me not as a daughter, but as a reflection of all the parts of himself he couldn't control, and that every time I pushed back, even as a teenager, it felt like a betrayal of the version of me he imagined in his head, the obedient, grateful, quiet child who knew her place. He admitted to using the trust, not out of greed, but out of panic. He claimed he didn't know how to live without controlling something, and since he couldn't control death, he tried to control everything else. The money, the narrative, meant he apologized, not directly, not in the way I needed, but in a roundabout, clumsy manner that made it clear he was trying, even if he still couldn't quite bring himself to kneel. He ended the letter with a sentence that haunts me still. I just didn't know how to love you in a way that didn't feel like ownership. I stared at those words for what felt like hours, reading them again and again, trying to decide if they counted as redemption, or if they were just another attempt to twist the knife gently, hoping I'd pull it out myself and thank him for the lesson. Because that's the hardest part about forgiveness. It rarely comes wrapped in clarity or justice, or even closure. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man who ruined you, trying to rebuild something with trembling hands and rotten wood. I didn't respond, I didn't call, I didn't write back. But I didn't burn the letter either. Instead, I folded it carefully and placed it in the same box where I kept my mother's last birthday card to me, a dusty collection of snapshots, and the title to the car he once swore was his. Not because I wanted to keep his words close, but because some truths need to be preserved, not to honor the person who spoke them, but to remind yourself of what you survived. Some people keep scars visible for the same reason. Weeks passed. Life began to bloom in small ways. I got approved for the new condo, smaller but mine, entirely mine. I changed jobs, just a lateral move, but one that came with a window view and a boss who didn't look at me like I owed him something. I started therapy, the real kind, not just the venting over wine kind, and slowly I began to understand that being free doesn't always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels like grief in disguise. The last time I saw Roy was completely by accident. I was at a small family gathering, Jake's birthday of all things, and he showed up, uninvited but tolerated, looking thinner, grayer, quieter. He didn't approach me, didn't try to start a conversation, just sat across the yard, under the shade of a tree, watching from a distance like a man finally aware that the room no longer rearranged itself when he entered. Our eyes met once, and in that moment, there was no hatred, no rage, just an unsettling sense of finality, like we both knew this chapter was closing whether we liked it or not. He didn't say anything, and for once neither did I, because some things don't need to be said. They just need to be survived, and some survivors don't need witnesses. They just need peace.